On the drop bay manifest, Gharos Secundus was just another contracted cleanup. Ash Lance, Spartan-rated. Insertion window at 0300 ship time. Ground contact in under 1 standard 10 count. Mission duration under 1 local day. The briefing packet leaned on familiar language. Industrial unrest. Communications blackout. Suspected hostile bioasset. Secure corporate nodes. Preserve physical infrastructure where feasible. Routine. The way Command used that word. I went through the recon stacks alone before the others boarded the bay. Thermal maps, LiDAR sweeps, old municipal layouts, partial corporate overlays that pretended the older tunnels weren't there. I traced my glove along cold holes where satellite feeds showed nothing. Crisp corridors with perfectly straight temperature lines, long bands across districts where data simply refused to render. The shapes nagged at me. They looked like someone had pressed a hand over parts of the map and creased the paper. I'd seen that pattern once on a different world, under a classification level that supposedly never touched my clearance. Every time my mind reached for that memory, I turned it aside. Flag it and the op changes. Flag it and the old files come back. Flag it and someone starts asking why only I walked off that station intact. So I left the fields unmarked. Instead, I locked the recon into my personal cache and walked back into the drop bay, frame by frame, like a man stepping onto a scaffold that had already tried to kill him once. Ash Lance stood in a loose half-circle under the drop rigs, armor open, helmets on hips, exo-frames drinking power from the shipside spine, Spartan chassis, heavy and slightly mismatched after too many refits. HUD tags floated over them in my helmet systems as I approached. Valdez, Morrow, Gage, Raiden, and the rest. Faces all blurred behind polarized glass in my memory now, but in that moment, they were just my unit, waiting on my word. Check complete on Lance 1 to Lance 3, I called across the bay, voice on squad channel and local at once. Lock harnesses, confirm green on seals, clear all manual safeties. Armor plates folded over my torso as the rig closed. The spinal plugs found their ports along my back with a machine's confidence. My HUD came online in layers, ammunition counts, positional grid, squad vitals, mission clock ticking toward insertion. Dominic, forecast says heavy downwash on approach. Valdez rolled his shoulder joints, making his frame sway on the suspension line. We divert to secondary LZ? Primary. I watched his vitals settle. Maglev Nexus gives us fields of fire and access below ground. Secondary is a glass bowl with no roof. Gage chuckled once. You call that a negative? The bay doors were still closed. No sense of the planet yet, just the numbers on my visor and the tension in my shoulders. Tiny green bars lined the bottom of my vision as each Spartan checked in. Listen up, I went on. If orbital overwatch drops, we stay tight. Rally at the Nexus, form a hard point, then push to corporate nodes once we have a perimeter. Nothing fancy. No ghost chasing, no solo heroics. Clicks of acknowledgement came back. No one asked about the gaps in the recon. No one knew to. The timer hit 0 and the bay shook as the cruiser's clamps cycled. Lock indicators along the ceiling flipped from red to steady green. The drop pods on their rails groaned forward until our rigs settled into them. A row of armored seeds waiting for gravity. Ship command to all Spartans. The overhead voice cut in, neutral and clipped. Insertion in 10. No deviation authorized. Expect minimal organized resistance. Biohazard protocols level 3. Level 3. Morrow's voice came dry. Somebody signed a form for that. Focus on your checklists, I replied, keeping my tone flat. We plant, we sweep, we wait for the next contract. That was the lie I most wanted to believe, that this was just another job and not the sequel to the one command never wrote down. The rails shunted our pods toward the launch sleeves. G-locks snapped around my limbs and chest like an extra skeleton. My world narrowed to the harness, the HUD, and a little schematic of the cruiser holding position over Gharos Secundus, a clean white triangle against an abstract globe. The triangle broke apart before we even launched. No warning blast. One instant, the ship sat stable over our insertion vector. The next, my HUD flared white across the entire upper hemisphere. A smear of light ripped across the cruiser's icon, like someone dragging a brush over wet ink. Status indicators vanished mid-refresh. "Command, Ash Lance Actual. Report event," I snapped. Silence. External feeds flickered back for the length of a breath. Chunks of hull tumbling. Light flares where atmosphere and power plants tore free together. Rubble icons streaming across our planned descent paths. Then only the scatter remained. "Lancenet, brace." My jaw locked hard. "We're going down either way." Emergency eject slammed the pod into launch alignment. Gravity took over. My view switched to the underside camera as we dropped. Clouds swallowed us almost immediately. White, then grey, then darker. Bits of the cruiser fell past, blazing briefly as they hit thicker air. The pod shook as pressure built. My harness dug into my ribs. Long-range comms flashed red, link broken, retrying, broken again. Above, the cruiser that bought our contract came apart in silence. We fell alone toward a planet that had slipped out of anyone's control. Abort orders would have meant nothing. There was nowhere to go but down. The pod hit atmosphere hard enough to jar my teeth. External temperature spiked on my feed. Stress gauges walked toward their limits, then eased back as the descent burn did its job. Orientation thrusters fought to keep us on vector, nudging us away from some of the falling rubble. The only voices on my net belonged to my unit now. "Cruiser's gone," Raiden's voice scratched in my ear. That wasn't a system failure. "Sure," Morrow answered, dry as dust. 1,000-crew warship just forgot how to exist. "Focus," I cut in. "We land, we regroup. Chain of command may be Ash, but doctrine still applies. Maglev Nexus is our rally. Stay controlled. Stick to the plan." A chorus of affirmations followed. Their faith ran through the lines between us, as solid as any steel. We punched through the lower cloud layers and the ground finally came into view. A drowned city, broken transit spines like snapped bones, plazas turned into shallow lakes by endless rain. Street grids glimmered under standing water. Tower monoliths leaned into each other, some already down, others waiting for gravity to finish their work. That was the first time I wondered if the planet itself had tried to clear the slate. "Adjusting for surface winds," the pod's machine voice announced. "Touchdown in 10, 9, a jerk. A lurch sideways as something massive flashed past close enough to rattle the skin. Thrusters screamed in my bones. Landing gear deployed late and crooked. We hit the ground sideways. Armor slammed against interior plating. My vision turned into a blur of icons. Harness springs screeched, tore, then caught. The pod skidded across something hard, smashed into a vertical surface, bounced, and finally stopped. Silence. Except for my suit listing my vitals like a stranger taking notes. "Report. Lance, I want checks, now." "Ash Lance 2, green." Valdez. 3, green. Gage. 4, green. Morrow. Others chimed in with various shades of unsteady. One icon stayed dark. We'd lost a voice somewhere between cloud and concrete. The system grayed his marker without asking my opinion. "Pods, report." I asked the wider net. Static. A faint burst of noise, then nothing. The other drops were out of range, down somewhere else, or gone with the cruiser. "Pod's done," Morrow concluded. "We flattened a good section of somebody's street with ours. It's welded to it." "Then we walk," I answered. "Primary objective stands. Nexus first. No searching for wrecks, no body hunts. We step into that, we just add to the count." The last line came out sharper than I intended. No one argued. My harness released. The pod hatch hydraulics tried, stuttered, and died. Gage braced under the manual crank and heaved until the hatch scraped open far enough for a Spartan frame. Grey daylight spilled in, bright after the pod's dim confinement. Rain drummed on our armor as we stepped out into Gharos Secundus. The planet felt hollowed out. Local channels stayed dead. Civilian emergency bands within our range stayed quiet. only rain on metal and concrete, and the occasional distant crack of something heavy collapsing under its own weight. We stood in what had once been a plaza. The ground sloped toward a sunken transit level, now a basin filled with rainwater and rubble. Shattered display pylons jutted at odd angles. On the far side, an elevated maglev line cut across the sky, its tracks sagging where supports had failed. Beyond that, the black outline of the station we'd targeted rose like a broken tooth. I mapped the route in my HUD. Nexus is less than a click northwest. We hug hard cover, watch for structural collapse and civilian remains. Cruiser? Ryden asked, quieter. Gone, I answered. Don't count on rescue from above. Command is whatever I say it is until someone proves otherwise. Move. We advanced in a shallow wedge, rifles tracking upper levels. Our boots splashed through water that hid cracked tiles and twisted metal. The city felt abandoned in a rush, then left to rot. Glass fronts of shops and offices hung in jagged frames. Transit vehicles lay sideways, half submerged and listing. We found the first bodies at the edge of the plaza. They wore armor not unlike ours, heavy frames with spinal ports and sealed helmets. Older pattern, bulkier. Blackened scars ringed every augmentation port and joint. The metal there hadn't just burned, it had crumpled inward, edges curled like something had bitten from outside to in. Morrow crouched beside one and tapped a gauntlet against the ruined connector. The metal flaked at his touch. That's not corrosion. Careful. I shifted my rifle. We don't know what did that. Log visual, leave the metal. The shapes matched too easily. Years ago, another facility, another squad. The same rings around ports that had once led into human flesh and steel. I cleared my throat. Helmets to low-res record only. Save bandwidth. That was the reason on paper. The other was that full resolution caught everything, and everything was how operations got sealed under the weight of their own evidence. More bodies turned up as we moved. Some in older armor, some in yard worker rigs, some clearly civilian. Anything that had ever plugged into a neural mesh carried the same marks. Ports crushed, metal crinkled inward. Hollows where conduits once ran, now dead and slick. This thing chose its targets. It focused on anyone who'd ever worn a spine full of steel. The maglev station loomed ahead, its upper facade torn open. The transit line leading in sagged under rain and time. The station's name had peeled away, leaving only a few letters. I didn't bother to read them. Dominic, Valdez murmured over the channel. I'm not seeing any powered systems. Emergency grid's dead. All the better, I replied. We seed our own grid. Once we lock this building down, we own this intersection. We moved up the cracked steps 2 by 2, rifles tight. The main doors hung slumped open, a warped metal curtain. I stepped through first. The concourse was larger than I'd expected, ringed by empty booths and dark turnstiles. Rainwater dripped from cracks in the ceiling, long tongues of clear fluid falling into shallow floor pools. The tracks ran below, exposed through a central opening, their surfaces slick in the dim light. Lance, secure pattern, I ordered. Valdez, Morrow, upper walkways. Gage, Raiden, lower platforms. Sensors at every access point. If something wanders into this place, it should regret it. Copy. Valdez already headed for a half-collapsed stairwell. I walked the perimeter, marking firing lanes and likely approaches. Old signage still clung to the walls, pointing out routes to districts now underwater. One side of the concourse had buckled where something heavy had punched through from above. Beyond that, cloudy light seeped in through ragged holes. No movement. My thermal showed only my people. The quiet settled around the station like dust. Maybe whatever burned those ports ran out of fuel, Raiden muttered. We plan around coverage, not hope, I replied. Keep your arcs tight. Valdez reached the top of the stairs and jogged along an overhead walkway, armor plates creaking. His vitals sat steady on my HUD. He vaulted a broken segment of railing and stepped onto a lightweight maintenance gantry that crossed above the square. "Gantry feels soft," he reported. "Metal's warped. I'm keeping weight near the beams. Log the stress points. If it drops, I want to know where it lands." I watched his icon move above us. Gage and Raiden's markers drifted on the lower level, sweeping between columns and benches. For 10 heartbeats it stayed as simple as a training sim. Then Valdez's vitals spiked. "Contact!" His shout cut off mid-word. His icon flared yellow, then red, then disappeared. My head snapped up. The overhead walkway lay empty. The gantry swayed. Armor pieces rained down. A shoulder plate, a forearm, a helmet that hit the floor, bounced once, then tumbled into the pit where the tracks ran. Upper level, eyes high. I swung my rifle up. "Watch your arcs. Fire on clear movement only." Something hit the floor beside me with a sharp, metallic note. I glanced down. A section of Valdez's chest plate lay at my feet. The armor around his central spinal port had been crushed inward in a perfect ring. Whatever had taken him had done it between one breath and the next, leaving nothing living. I lifted my rifle toward the ceiling. Movement, a blur along the beams, weight crossing overhead. My HUD tried to lock it, threw a ghost outline onto empty air, then lost it as the shape slipped into a dark maintenance shaft at the far end of the concourse. I caught a glimpse. Enough to know I hadn't fought this exact shape before. Long, ridged torso. Limbs bent at angles that could mimic a Spartan frame if you squinted. Armored hide glistening under the drip lines. No head in the human sense, just a forward mass with inner structures that flexed and slid as it moved. It moved like something that understood height and angles better than we did, and retreated as soon as it drew fire. "Contact on the gantries," I reported. "Single fast mover above. Extreme vertical mobility. Stay clear of hanging positions. Morrow gauge. Tighten arcs. Cover lower entries." "Valdez?" Gage asked, already knowing. "Gone." No one shouted his name. With Spartan infantry, death is always sitting at the table. You just notice when a chair goes empty. We swept the upper level cautiously, rifles tracking every trace of motion. The creature didn't strike again. It let us walk under its absence and get used to it. When it came back, it chose its angle. Gage and Raiden moved along the lower platform, sweeping their sights between columns. Above them, the narrow catwalk ringing the concourse sagged where the earlier impact had hit. Metal there was spidered with hairline fractures. My HUD painted a faint heat trace on that section, a heartbeat before anything moved. My brain wrote it off as phantom data. Then the metal split. The creature dropped through the ceiling with limbs tucked, a black seed falling. It hit the platform between Gage and Raiden, flesh and plating colliding with a roar of overstressed metal. Its limbs shot out faster than my eye could track. Gage fired point blank. Rounds punched into its flank and tore out a section of hide. Dark fluid sprayed across the platform and onto the deck. Where it landed, the deck began to melt. The fluid chewed through the transit platform like a slow cutter. Metal darkened, thinned, then opened in ragged holes. The creature kept moving. It whipped a limb around the back of Gage's neck, plating and twisted. The crack over comms punched through the audio filters. His spine went. The thing shoved off his falling frame and leapt sideways, vanishing into the open track pit as the floor gave way under its weight. Raiden grabbed for the edge, caught a beam, and hauled himself back with a grunt, boots scrabbling. Deck plates dropped into the darkness behind him, trailing that hissing fluid. "Avoid that blood," I snapped. "Rails and solid beams only." "Port seals holding," Raiden reported, voice ragged. "Gauges, I know." Sensor packets hit my HUD from the deployables we'd just started to place. Short glimpses, broken by interference. A flash of armored hide slicing along a lower corridor, then static. It moved with the confidence of something that knew this place better than we ever would. Our vantage point was already corroding beneath us. I looked up at the fractured ceiling. The station had too many vertical paths, too many access shafts, and maintenance doors. Anything that owned the upper levels could strike from a dozen angles. "Lance, collapse perimeter," I ordered. "This station's a sieve. We're dropping to the tunnels. Morrow, find us a route to sewers and maintenance galleries. Raiden, cover our exit." "Dominic, if we push it now, we might box it here," Morrow argued. "In here it can fall on us from anywhere it likes," I answered. "Below, we trade open air for fewer lines of sight." "Or more," Raiden muttered. "Move." We fell back toward a half-collapsed stairwell that led to the lower platforms, and beyond them to access tunnels. As we moved, my HUD flickered again. For a heartbeat, the creature's silhouette appeared in perfect clarity on my visor, hanging inverted from a ceiling pipe over the far concourse. The overlay traced every limb and ridge, as if my system held a full model of it. Then the hallway was empty, and the overlay vanished. I pulled my logs. No replay. The system flagged it as transient. Just a glitch, I told myself. Stressed neural mesh, bad data. I stepped into the menu, dialed my targeting sensitivity down a few notches, purged the log, and led what remained of Ash Lance into the guts of Gharos Secundus. The stairs ended on a narrow landing that opened into a service corridor. Old conduit panels lined the walls. The air cooled, dampness clinging to armor joints. Water ran along the floor in a shallow stream, carrying grit and shredded trash. We followed the passage to a round junction chamber that had once tied sewers and maintenance ducts together. It was larger than the cramped tunnel suggested, like a drowned chapel more than a utility node. Platforms ringed a central sump where runoff gathered before dropping into deeper channels. Benches had been dragged here long ago and bolted to raised concrete. Supply crates and rations lay stacked along one wall. The marks of long occupation covered the place. I walked to the center and turned slowly, helmet lights raking the walls. Helmets ringed the chamber, lined up on a ledge just above head height. Too regular for trophies. They looked like offerings. Some were intact, some cracked. A few still held fragments of bone and dried tissue behind their visors. Above the ledge, on a broad section of wall, colonists had carved and painted. The mural was crude but clear. A long arched shape hovered over a row of human figures. The people knelt, heads bowed. The thing above them curved like a segment of transit track with ridges and hooks. Underneath, scratched deep into the metal, someone had written, "Prowler in the drains, take the heavy ones and leave the children." Whoever lived down here, they'd tried to bargain with it. "Somebody else called this a temple," Morrow murmured. "Check the crates," I ordered. "Rations, medpacks, power cells, anything usable. Raiden gauge is gone, your point for lower tunnels now." He grunted assent. His vitals glowed high-stress yellow. Mine didn't look better. Near the two main doorways, scratched symbols caught my eye. Simple repeated marks carved at consistent heights. 3 intersecting lines here. A circle divided into odd segments there. Each doorway had a variation, but placement followed a pattern. I crouched and traced one symbol with a gloved finger, careful not to touch bare metal. "Colonists marking something," I murmured on command channel. "Entry types, safe routes, or the opposite?" "Could be shrines," Morrow replied. "Shrines don't keep you breathing long enough to grow this big," I said. "Log every symbol and drop them on our map. Whatever they thought mattered, I want to see if the pattern holds." Our sensors picked up the first hint of return activity while we were still stripping crates. A faint vibration came through the decking, barely enough to register. Then a sharper ping from the corridor to our left. "Movement," Raiden warned. "Upper pipe, quadrant 3. The motion icon flared, dimmed, then popped up on the opposite side of the door. Something paced just beyond the threshold. That doorway carried a heavy cluster of colonist marks, more than any other entry. Half the wall around the frame lay crosshatched in carved symbols, overlapping like the last work of hands that had run out of space and time. Hold fire, I ordered. Rounds stay out of that hatch until we know the backdrop. The motion icon froze dead center on the door for several heartbeats. Then it faded. Sensors flattened out. Maybe it doesn't like the art, Morrow muttered. Same logic we're using, I answered. Things leave marks when those marks matter. Across the chamber, a ceiling vent held only a few scratches, bare compared to the hatch. Raiden moved under it without thinking, eyes on his scope. That was where the creature chose to come through. Metal above him bulged. The vent grating tore free and dropped. A limp human shape fell with it, tangled in shreds of clothing and harness. The body hit the bench beside Raiden and rolled to the floor, face down, limbs arranged neatly, arms stretched out as if in greeting. "Contact above!" My voice cracked across the channel. Raiden jerked back. The corpse convulsed as something behind it shifted. A limb shot down, hooked under the rim of Raiden's helmet, and yanked. He fired once, a reflex shot that tore into the ceiling. Then his body vanished into the vent. His boots scraped the frame and were gone. Morrow and I fired into the hole. Rounds sparked off brick and steel. A smear of dark fluid rolled down from the vent, hissing where it met the edge. The creature stayed hidden. It dragged Raiden into the ductwork and left us with a dead colonist as a calling card. We checked the corpse that had fallen first. Colonist, thin and long gone. Ports along its spine carried the same crushed rings. Someone had positioned it over the vent like a plug, then kicked it loose at the right moment. The colonists in the mural had begged the prowler to take the heavy ones. It had, and now it used them as bait. I stared up into the vent's dark mouth. Acid streaks marked the metal. "Dominic," Morrow said quietly, "you think those symbols still count as deals? Or just scratches it learned to walk around? Whatever rules they thought they wrote, the boards changed," I answered. "But people keep drawing lines even after the world stops caring." I pulled my map up and overlaid symbol positions with the known tunnel layout. Patterns emerged, heavy markings clustered on certain doors and intersections. Some lined up with structural support points, some didn't. I marked them all. Then I led what remained of Ash Lance into tunnels the colonists had labelled more lightly. Under the transit and habitation layers, the city's shape warped. The first sewer level looked like any municipal system. Concrete channels, rusted pipes, narrow walkways. The next level down had fewer right angles. Pipes merged and split in ways that ignored efficient engineering. Metal supports bulged as if something behind them had pressed outward. We walked corridors where conduit bundles had fused into thick branching trunks climbing the walls. Railings sagged and reformed into intricate curves. Some of those curves looked disturbingly like unit insignias if you stood back and tilted your head. Morrow ran his hand close to one such distortion, careful not to touch. "Maybe they hired artists." "Artists don't melt structural steel," I replied. "Eyes up." Corpses appeared less often here, but when we found them, they'd been arranged. One armoured body knelt in the centre of a corridor, rifle raised, helmet turned toward us. Sensors picked up a faint heat signature inside the frame. "Hold," I ordered. "Possible survivor." We edged closer. The figure stayed locked. At 10 meters, the heat signature flickered. I switched to scope. The warmth came from a cluster of power cells tucked into the chest cavity. The armor stood empty. Joints were braced by severed limbs and cabling jammed into place. It formed a near-perfect silhouette of a Spartan at ready. The creature had built itself a decoy and tuned it to our sensors. It understood how we read the world and had chosen to mimic it. Behind us, something shifted at the edge of awareness. A scream burst across the net. One of our rear guards, Axel, dropped as his leg actuator buckled under a sudden torque. He toppled, armor crashing into the warped floor. Before anyone pivoted, a long limb hooked his ankle, dragged him into a side conduit, and vanished. Morrow and I fired at the retreating shape. Our shots chewed old concrete. Axel's vitals flatlined. Forget the puppets, I said. Any frame that doesn't answer a direct call is a trap, unless we have time to strip it. The creature took the lesson, then slipped away. No celebration, no noise, just another body removed from the count. Further down, the tunnel geometry twisted harder. Acid burns widened certain passageways, rounding corners. In others, the ceiling dipped low, forcing our bulky frames into a crouch. The thing clearly favored those. Our HUDs started to fail in ways that mattered. It began as minor lag, reticles dragging half a beat behind our gaze, motion icons flickering too fast to tie to real movement. Then the ghosts came. The next time the creature drew near, I felt it before the sensors woke. Pressure gathered at the base of my skull, dull and heavy. For a few heartbeats, the tunnel ahead appeared in my mind like a second map. Angles, distances, overhead beams. Then my visor snapped into a different view. The corridor in front of me vanished. Instead, I saw a wireframe of that same corridor from a vantage point behind and above, like I stood where the creature might perch. My own armored back glowed on the schematic, along with my men, each limb reduced to lines and vectors, each exposed plate tagged as an opening. I hard rebooted my HUD display, ignoring every warning. The real railings, bulged supports, warped floor all lay exactly where the wireframe had placed them. My mind spun between perspectives. "Dominic!" Morrow's voice came sharp. "What are you doing?" "System glitch," I grunted, resealing the helmet. "Targeting suite crosswired. I'm isolating it." We didn't get the luxury of focus. The creature lunged from a side channel, claws catching one of our Spartans in the arm. The soldier fired reflexively. His HUD, apparently tracking a target a meter to the left, corrected his aim at the last moment. His shot blew a hole in a support pillar instead of hitting the creature. The beam gave way. Ceiling segments dropped, opening space above the corridor. The creature rode the falling rubble as cover and vanished into the new gap before we could adjust. After that, I dived into the suit menus and shut down most of our assistive systems. Aim correction, predictive motion tracking, neural co-processing routines, anything the creature could twist into a weapon against us went dark. The others cursed as their suits dropped into simpler modes. "We paid for those toys," Morrow muttered. "We're not the only ones using them anymore," I answered. At a three-way junction, we halted. The path left showed extreme warping, walls bulged and dense with colonist marks. The corridor straight ahead descended into deeper tunnel with relatively clean geometry. The right-hand passage lay half-flooded, runoff on the surface shimmering with a faint wrong light that made my eyes ache. "Left's where they really didn't want to go," Morrow argued. "More marks, more layers." "Or where they thought it slept," I countered. "Right is runoff glowing in all the ways I don't trust. Last resort." "So we go straight," he concluded. "Down," I agreed. As we descended, the city's lived-in feel fell away. Walls smoothed, corners rounded, equipment mounts appeared at regular intervals, brackets for machines that no longer existed, plates bolted to the floor where something large and heavy had once sat. On one wall, between acid scars, an emblem clung half-erased, circular crest, stylized figure at its center. Most of the words around it were gone, but enough letters remained to match an old project designation I'd been ordered to forget. My palm found the damaged metal. The sealed station. The one where my squad died under orders that never appeared on any record. The project we were told had been buried with them. I took my hand away. "Corporate basement," Morrow observed. "Nobody said there was a lab under this place." "They never do," I answered. The corridor opened onto a chamber that felt wrong before our lights hit it. Racks circled the walls. Each held a cradle built to support a human-sized frame. Straps for limbs, lock points for armor, a cluster of neural connectors at the spine, feeding into thick bundles of cable and tubing disappearing into the walls. Some cradles stood empty. Some still held armor frames. Most had been torn open, metal twisted outward as if something inside had grown beyond restraint. Acid pockmarks freckled the floor and rack bases, concentrated where the conduits converged. I walked between the cradles, reading shapes. The connector ports mirrored the ones along our own spines. Spartan harnesses, Morrow breathed. Older pattern, but close. Not strictly Spartan. I traced a broken port. Parallel line, different sponsor, same anatomy. On one wall, under a smear of burned metal, I found the emblem again. A stylized figure docked into a frame, ringed by a circle of inward arrows. Half a name under it, enough letters to match the black line I'd once served. First attempt at building a predator out of our kind. Dominic, Morrow went on, eyes flicking over the racks. You seeing it the way I am? This isn't municipal. This is off-book. They built something down here. They build a lot of things in a lot of basements, I answered. Stay clear of any live ports. Nobody hooks into anything without going through me first. No one's eager to jack into a graveyard, he muttered. I should have left it there. Instead, I moved to the central console. The interface was old, but backup power still trickled through. Faint warning lights glowed. A diagnostic port hung open, cables spilling like dead snakes. The ports along my spine itched. We needed information. Moving blind was just feeding bodies into the dark. Data, even toxic, was leverage. I clipped a diagnostic tether from my suit to the console and initiated a low-level handshake, fingers hovering over manual cut. Just a glimpse, I told myself. Just enough to learn the frame of what they'd built. The world narrowed to code. Log fragments crawled past, test series numbers, casualty lists, command directives, phrases lodged in my skull, behavioral divergence, motor learning outside expected sets, spontaneous reconfiguration of external structure, priority target class, augmented heavy infantry. Half a line flashed my designation or near enough, then burned into static. Someone had tried to wipe this system. Their erasures still left fingerprints. They'd trained something here to hunt people like us and lost control. Something else rode the data. An outline traced the path of my neural mesh, like invisible fingers following the lines. A pressure moved where the code moved. Curious more than hostile, mapping. Dominic, you're moving in a way that's bad for my heart, Morrow commented from somewhere outside. I tore the tether free. Sparks spat from the console. Old logs, I answered, voice thin to my own ears. Bioweapon site. They bred something that prefers our kind. Then it chewed them to pieces. No shock. You look shocked, Morrow replied. I didn't answer. The creature chose that moment to make a statement. At the far side of the cradle room, just outside our lights, a shape peeled from the shadows and stepped into view. Full exposure was worse than fragments. A long torso, ridged and armored, rode on multiple limb pairs that could stack into a rough bipedal stance or spread into a climbing sprawl. Outer plating had grown into lines that echoed Spartan armor bulk. The angle of shoulders, the slant of chest, the thickness of thigh segments. Between plates, muscle and other tissue flexed with obscene ease. It halted at the rack edge and tilted what passed for a head. For a heartbeat, its posture matched mine. Weight centered, forward lean at the hips, arms slightly raised. It knew my stance because it had studied men like me in these same cradles. We raised rifles together. It didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned into the nearest empty cradle. Limbs wrapped around the frame. It mimed a man strapping in for augmentation, ports along its hide sliding against the connectors. The room responded. Sensors flickered. Old restraints twitched, eager to close. Acid dripped from its flanks onto the floor, eating fresh scars into the metal. We opened fire. Rounds tore racks and walls. The creature twisted out of the cradle and dove through a gap between consoles, moving faster than our sights could track. It punched through a half-melted bulkhead and vanished into the tunnels beyond, leaving a trail of damage and a thin smear of hissing fluid. Alarm klaxons choked into life overhead on long-delayed timers. Doors in the distance cycled, some opening, some grinding against warped frames. My brief interface had woken parts of the facility that should have stayed dead. Morrow. I kept my eyes on the breach. Every port you see, treat it like a live mouth. No one touches one again. That includes me. Use that phrasing. Happy to, he muttered. The console flickered one last time and died for good. We left the cradle room with more questions than ammo and headed for the only thing that still looked like an answer. The waste reactor complex that had once handled the sector's runoff and industrial trash. On my map, it sat as a dense knot deep below. The colonists had tried to drown their monster there and failed. Training said you hold a defensive posture against unknown superior threats. Secure a hardpoint, contain, wait for reinforcements. On the sealed operation, we'd done exactly that. The enemy came through vents and dropped ceilings and ate us in our sleep. Dominic. Morrow bumped his helmet lightly against mine as we paused at another junction. We could hole up, find a one-way in room, layer thermals, wait. Somebody's going to notice the cruiser's missing. They'll notice, I agreed. Then they'll write an accident line and quietly stop answering this planet's calls. How long do you think those colonists prayed in that junction chamber? How many told themselves the same story? Morrow didn't push again. We hit it where it nests, I said. Whatever passes for a nest. Either that place kills it or kills us. I'm not watching another slow cull. Reactor it is, he said. The path cut through pump caverns and maintenance halls. I stopped thinking in fire lanes and started thinking in traps. We used every scrap of environment we could. Where colonist marks clustered around a door, we painted our own over them with chem from field kits, clumsy copies. Some doors we oversigned, some we left bare. We watched to see which the creature avoided and which it overwritten. In one pump cavern, we ringed a section of ceiling walkway with pressure mines and planted chemical charges around the runoff basins. I placed Trent, one of our quieter Spartans, in the open on a central platform as bait, his armor light steady. The creature treated the trap like a lesson, not a death sentence. A colonist body slid from a side passage into the cavern, stripped, ports crushed, limbs repositioned. The corpse skidded onto a pressure plate and came to rest. The mines on that side of the walkway detonated. Shards of metal rained down with chunks of ceiling. While we tracked the blast, the creature moved. It surged along the opposite side, hugging low to the beams, skirting the live mines. From below, it snagged Trent's leg actuator and hip with one clean sweep. Trent fired downward as he fell. His rounds tore open the side of the runoff basin instead of the creature. Tainted fluid poured across the floor, pooling around our charges, soaking det cord and rendering half the pattern useless. The creature retreated along the wall, dragging Trent. The mines on that side never triggered. It had read our pressure nets and found the gaps. I watched the whole failure from an upper platform, fingers grinding against my rifle's grip. Dominic, Morrow called. We can't keep feeding it drills. Either we draw a line and die on it, or we teach this thing every trick we know. We'll draw the line, I answered. At the reactor. Neither of us liked it. Every other path ended with our bodies arranged as study pieces. On a high-maintenance bridge spanning a vast runoff shaft, we made one more attempt to hurt it before the final stand. The bridge was a narrow strip of metal with thin rails, slung between two concrete towers. Far below, runoff churned, glowing faintly where industrial waste mixed with something worse. Mist rose in steady curls. We wired the bridge supports with shaped charges, keyed to blow when a Spartan weight load crossed a marked segment. Simple and brutal. If the creature took the bridge, we'd drop it and the span into the shaft. We crossed in staggered groups. My boots creaked the plates at the center. The cables hummed under tension. Charges are hot, Morrow confirmed from the far tower. One bad step and we all go swimming." "Not the plan," I answered. "Watch the upper levels. It'll look for anything but the obvious path. If it missteps, though, make it hurt." It closed in without sound. No scrape of claws, no hiss. One moment the bridge behind us was empty. The next, the load sensor tripped. My HUD flared an icon by the near tower. For a heartbeat, I thought it had walked onto the plates. Then I realized the weight hung below. The creature clung under the bridge, limbs hooked around beams running its length. It moved hand over hand along the underside, using our structure as armor. Its mass registered on the supports, but outside the plates we'd wired. "Under!" I snapped. Morrow pivoted and fired downward. Rounds punched through decking, kicked sparks into the shaft. The creature lashed a limb up through the bridge, punched through a support column, and dropped back. The damage was enough. One of our soldiers, scrambling to shift weight, stepped onto a wired plate. The charges blew. Explosions tore through anchor points. The bridge dropped. Steel wrenched under my boots. The world tilted. I grabbed a cable with both hands and swung as sections of span tore free and plunged past. Spartans fell with them, voices flaring sharp and short on the net before the shaft and its chemistry took them. The creature fell too, but it had already chosen its escape. It launched sideways toward a maintenance ledge built into the tower, struck at a high angle, and vanished into a vertical duct, leaving us with a ruined bridge and fewer guns. By the time I hauled myself onto the far tower's remnants, our unit was a fraction of its starting strength. Bodies began to appear where we hadn't left them. Trent's half-melted frame turned up kneeling in a side passage, limbs folded just so, armor etched with fresh acid trails in new patterns. Another soldier from the bridge sat propped upright against a wall once thick with colonist marks. The creature had burned those marks away and etched its own, long spirals and branching lines. It had taken the colonists' language of desperation and turned it into territory markers and memory. My neural mesh throbbed whenever we passed those new etchings. HUD elements flickered near them, overlaying routes and angles that didn't come from any map I knew. We reached the waste reactor's outer edge with barely enough bodies to form a loose line. The complex rose around us in layers, massive vertical cylinders, corroded catwalks, thick pipes feeding sumps. Old restraint rigs hung over the deepest pools, chains dipping into dark liquid. The colonists had tried to drown something here. Heavy clamps, thick shackles, nets of cable. They'd thrown hardware at the problem until nothing else remained. All of it lay broken now. From an upper catwalk, I traced routes in my mind. If I wanted to kill something like this, how would I trap it long enough for mass and physics to do the work? The answer matched the sealed operations doctrine. Except this time I stopped pretending survival sat at the top of the list. The maze came first. "We don't have bodies to hold every path," Morrow objected on private channel as I laid out the plan. "We don't need to hold them," I said. "We just have to define them. Block certain routes with partial collapses, weaken supports in sequence, set overloads on filtration stacks and coolant reserves. When it chases us, it drags half the structure down on its own head." "And on ours," he pointed out. "Yes." He studied my face for a long second, then nodded once. "Fine. I never liked reactors anyway." We placed what was left of Ashlance at critical points, some on high catwalks with manual detonators for charges wired to supports, some near valve wheels that could flood lower levels or vent heat. Every position carried a high chance of death once the creature moved. I took the central platform above the deepest sump. Thick control conduits still ran from the core consoles into the stacks. The main overload lever was manual. No remote, no shortcut. You had to be here, hand on metal. I keyed my neural mesh to full broadcast. Every suppression routine I'd layered in on the way down, I stripped away. My presence burned in the local net like a flare. The pressure in my head swelled in answer. "Dominic," Morrow muttered over command channel, "you're shining like a beacon. That's the point, I said. It wants augmented heavy infantry. It wants me. We give it what it wants and pretend that gives us an edge. You sure you're not just making this personal? It's been personal since the first port it crushed. That wasn't the whole truth. It had been personal since the sealed station and the men whose names never made it into any brief. Men a project file had written off as acceptable losses. This thing was one of those tools sharpened by time and blood, and it had learned. The pressure in my skull shifted. My HUD twitched and drew a thin line along one of the upper catwalks, angling down toward my platform, not from my map. It was coming. Positions, I ordered. It knows. It'll come in sideways, not straight. Keep chatter down. Trust your eyes over your HUD. The first death came fast. The creature hit one of the outer squads from above, wedging itself between pipes and rail, tearing a man from his harness before his thumb reached his detonator. Instead of pushing deeper, it doubled back along a different path and removed another trigger, this time going for the soldier's hands, dissecting them with careful blows. He lived for a few panicked seconds with useless fingers and dead triggers. It had seen the wiring. It knew what switches and grips meant. Icons flared and died on my HUD. Our carefully chained collapses frayed. Leave it untouched, and we'd end with a half-fallen maze and a free predator. Dominic, Morrow urged. We're losing triggers. We fall back. Pick one choke, stairwell, valve chamber, something narrow, and strip it down to a kill box. I saw the sealed operation again. Tight corridors, barricades, doors we watched while the ceiling opened. Sleep, then teeth. No, I answered. If we fall back, we give it time. Time built its puppets and its new marks. We keep the maze moving, even if that ends with me on a ladder and it on the rungs behind. You know that's a terrible speech, he said. I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to make sure nothing useful leaves this pit. He paused, then, low, you think they'll treat this like the sealed op? I think if we leave anything alive, someone will call it salvage. Morrow cursed in a language I didn't know. Then let's deny them their salvage. We triggered some secondary charges early, blowing platforms where our people still fought, just to keep the creature away from clean exits. In one case, I dropped an entire stairwell under a Spartan locked in a grapple with it. His last words on the net were simple. Do it. I did. He vanished into steam and wreckage, taking a piece of the creature with him and buying us seconds. The reactor groaned as we tore supports away. Towers leaned, coolant reservoirs warped. Somewhere overhead, valves failed and streams of superheated liquid began to cascade down channels never meant to carry that load. The creature tightened its circle around me like a looped cable. Its attention felt like a physical hand on my chest. The pressure in my skull acquired direction. When it finally stepped onto the central gantry, we were close enough that I saw the details of its growth. Its plates no longer just echoed Spartan bulk. In places, they had picked up exact armor lines, the curve of a specific shoulder pattern, the bevel of a standard chest plate. Its inner musculature twitched in drills we taught recruits on day one. It had studied how we moved and built counters into its body. It stopped 3 meters away and mirrored my stance again. Rifle leveled, limbs flexed. It held the moment with an almost human stillness. For a second, the noise of the dying reactor dropped away. Just me, the creature, and 2 overlapping maps of the same space. My HUD blanked, then came back with a new overlay. I saw myself from above the way it did, not as a person, as a cluster of vectors, limb angles, armor plates, exposed seams. The creature's world was geometry and stress curves, the way metal folded under force. My weapon registered as a hazard cone. My ports glowed, soft targets waiting for teeth. I jerked the rifle up and fired. It moved in the same instant. The first volley carved into its flank, spraying more of that corrosive fluid across the gantry. Metal hissed and sagged under our feet. It lunged in, whipping a limb like a hammer. The strike caught my barrel and bent it out of my hands. Another limb punched into the joint of my left shoulder, slipping between plates like a knife. Pain flared hot. My left arm went dead. We locked into a grapple. A Spartan frame doesn't excel at wrestling something with more limbs and fewer constraints. Every time I found a grip, more points of contact pressed in. We traded impacts across the heaving gantry. Each splash of its blood erased more of our footing. It groped for the ports along my spine, claws hooking for direct access. I twisted and let it rip simpler armor instead. It tried to wrench my head back for a bite, mouth opening on a structure that didn't match teeth. I drove a knee up into its midsection and felt something tear that wasn't bone. My HUD flickered between my own view and that elevated angle where we were both just shapes. One thought cut through the static. Keep it on this gantry under the failing towers. The overload would never erase it cleanly, but burial might slow it into irrelevance. The lever sat behind it at the far end of the platform. A straight rush would let it open me from throat to navel. So I stole its trick and used the environment. I let it drive me toward the rail, every muscle straining. Its body language read like victory, a surge of pressure as it leaned in, confident in more limbs and better balance. At the last instant, I shifted my weight and rolled, letting its momentum carry it forward. Its front limbs skidded on acid-eaten metal. One punched through the grating, leaving it briefly off balance. I drove my shoulder into its side and pinned it against the rail and the overload housing. It reacted with pure force. Limbs punched into my chest and abdomen plates. I felt metal give and something warm spill inside the suit, wrong and spreading. I clamped my right hand around one of its limbs and held it there, locking us together. With my useless left, I reached past its bulk and groped for the lever. Fingers closed. I pulled. The overload engaged with a mechanical thunk that ran up my arm. Warnings flared across every remaining display. Control rods long dormant jolted into motion. Filtration stacks screamed as sudden heat and stress tore at their frames. "Dominic," Morrow's voice came faint and distant. "That it?" "That's it," I managed. The reactor tore itself apart. Towers toppled inward, already weakened by our charges. Segments of metal and concrete broke free and hit the sump. Coolant tanks split and dumped cascades of liquid. The gantry buckled. I tightened my grip on the creature as we fell. We smashed into a lower beam. Pain turned glassy. Something in my back tore loose. Its limbs spasmed, digging into me and the metal both. The beam snapped. We dropped again through a storm of falling machinery and boiling fluid. The sump rose like a dark mouth, full of churning waste and old chains. We hit the mass of rubble that went first instead of the pool itself. Collapsing towers piled onto us, driving the creature and me into a tight pocket of bent steel and stone. It finally screamed then. Not words, not anything that carried intent I could translate. Just the noise of too many structures breaking at once. Limbs lashed. One tore away under a fallen girder. Its blood fanned out, carving trenches in the surrounding wreckage. Some of that fluid splashed across the ports exposed by my torn armor. Heat punched into my nervous system like a second signal, echoing the pressure I'd felt whenever it drew near. My HUD died for good. No more overlays, no more icons. Only darkness, pain, and the weight of a city's garbage on my chest. I don't remember the exact moment consciousness went. Fragments stayed, scraping overhead. Metal shifting, not frantic, testing. Learning how this new cage flexed. A hard, brief light as someone cut through steel. A voice ordering more power to the torches. Hands on my armor. A face behind a med mask leaning in. Questions I didn't answer. Shipboard gravity, steady under my back. A certainty in my gut that we'd failed at something large, even if we'd survived the part the cameras would care about. I woke in a med bay, strapped into a diagnostic frame. Armor gone. Bandages wrapped my chest and left side where ports had been opened. Lines ran from my veins into machines I didn't recognize. Beyond a glass partition, a group of technicians in clean suits maneuvered a containment cradle. Inside lay several large chunks of tissue and plating. Dark, ridged, twitching faintly under restraints. They hadn't left the creature buried in the reactor. They hadn't dropped the complex into a sealed exclusion and walked away. They'd cut their prize out of the ruin and brought it aboard. Of course they had. "Welcome back." A voice drew my attention right. A woman in medical white stood there, tablet in hand. Short hair, tired eyes, rank pin I ignored. She could have been any medic I'd watched patch men up for another tour. "You're Dominic Sayer, Ash Lance Actual," she said. "You've been out for 2 ship days. We've stabilized your wounds. There's significant neural mesh damage, but we believe..." Her words blurred. A faint overlay shimmered at the edge of my vision. Not a clean HUD. Lines and nodes traced the med bay around me. The bed, the doorway, the corridor beyond. People moving along paths the overlay marked from an elevated vantage. I blinked hard. The lines stayed. They shifted smoothly as the room moved. "Dominic?" she asked. "Can you follow my hand?" She held up 2 fingers and moved them side to side. I tracked them, but the lines in my head tracked the route she'd take if she turned. The angle where she had to twist to clear a trolley. The distance from her current spot to the door, then to the containment bay. "I can see you," I said. "Vision's off, but functional." "That's expected," she replied. "You've got contamination around several augmentation ports. We had to excise tissue and flood the area with neutralizing agents. There may be residual interference." "From the project's favorite toy," I said. Her eyes flicked toward the partition. "The samples are contained. Full quarantine. You can focus on your own recovery." I let the reassurance hang. Later, an intelligence officer took her place. Middle-aged, the kind of man who lived closer to screens than battlefields. He carried a recorder and a portable display. "Dominic Sayer," he began. "We need your account of events on Gharos Secundus, particularly the hostile bioasset encountered in the sewers and reactor." He laid out questions with professional calm. Nature of the entity, interaction with Spartan-class augmentation, status of the facility infrastructure, any signs of ongoing threat beyond the collected samples. He wanted more than safety or closure. His superiors wanted a usable threat, something that could be pointed. My mesh buzzed lightly under my skin, like something there had opinions. "The entity was an off-book bioweapon," I said. "Developed alongside Spartan tech. High adaptability. Learned from each encounter. Prioritized augmented heavy infantry. Used terrain aggressively and could interfere with our neural suites at short range." "You experienced this interference yourself," he noted. "Yes. Describe it." I did briefly. The pressure in the skull, the false overlays, the perspective shifts. I kept the tone clinical. I left out the feeling of seeing myself reduced to target vectors. I left out the faint sense that some of that view had followed me to the med bay. "Do you believe any of that interference persists now?" he asked, watching my eyes. I looked past him, through the glass, at the cradle. The samples inside twitched occasionally. Reflex arcs, the medtechs told themselves. Post-mortem discharge. The motions didn't feel random. Limbs tested restraints, pressed seam lines, then relaxed. Patterns of pressure, like a prisoner learning handcuffs. Lines traced themselves across my inner vision, running from the cradle through the ship's decks. Hallways, access shafts, vents. Some of those lines started from my own chest. "I think the interference comes from mesh damage and residual chemistry," I answered slowly. "I don't read an ongoing external control. My judgment's mine." He watched me for several heartbeats. "Do you recommend sterilization of the samples and facility remains?" Images from the sealed station rose. The scuttled hull, wiped data, official lines that nothing had happened. Men who'd died nameless so a project could quietly reset. On Gharos Secundus, the colonists had carved prayers on the walls and offered up the heavy ones. The system had taken their fear and called it experiment. If I called for fire now, command would likely comply. They'd send a quiet instruction, purge the ship of certain cargo, bury another failure, and build another somewhere else. If I recommended salvage, the horror wouldn't end. It would walk into new cages, new projects, new excuses. Maybe buried inside that, someone would learn the right lesson instead of the profitable one. That was the story I chose. The entity is partially entombed by the reactor collapse, I said. These samples are our only route to understanding its full capabilities. I recommend containment, study, and controlled application against hostile augmented forces in future conflicts. With strict safeguards, the benefits can outweigh the risks. He tapped a note into his slate. And the risk to our own forces? Manageable, I lied. Now that we know its preferences, it thrives in dense infrastructure and heavy augmentation networks. We can choose how often we offer those. He nodded, satisfied. Your recommendation will go on the asset file. Once medical clears you, we'll evaluate you for redeployment. He gathered his devices and left without another look at the cradle. Over the next days, my body did what it could. I walked short loops of the med bay with a frame under my arms, testing new limits. The scratching began on the second night. At first it blended with ship noise, hull plates flexing, footsteps in corridors. But this sound had a pattern. Short, insistent taps, moving along the wall, then up, then across the ceiling. I watched the corridor through the small window in my door. When an orderly pushed a cart past, the tapping moved several meters ahead of him, then fell behind, like something pacing patrol routes. The med staff didn't react. No flick of eyes upward as the pattern passed overhead. They stayed with their charts and screens. I lifted my hand and brushed fingertips along the wall beside my bed. The overlay in my vision brightened, lines sharpening along certain routes. The ship's internal schematic unfolded, not as a clean tech diagram, but in the same predatory geometry I'd felt in the reactor. Nodes where pressure mattered, gaps between patrols, shortcuts through maintenance tunnels. Two sources glowed brightest, one centered on the containment bay, the other pulsed faintly from my own torso. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. The scratching drifted again, stopped precisely above me, lingered there, then faded. Reporting this would be easy. One call on the comm, and I'd have the medic, then the intelligence man, then scanners and probes. They'd open my ports, run their tests, and someone with a quiet signature would decide whether Dominic Sayer remained viable. Subject compromised, asset contaminated. Remove and replace. Instead, I closed my eyes. On Gharos Secundus, the colonists had begged their prowler to take the heavy ones and spare the children. On the sealed station, command had ordered my brothers to die in silence so a project could reset. On this ship, an officer had listened to my measured report and heard only a new tool. I'd given him the words he needed to keep it alive. I'd tied myself into its chain of custody. Lines and nodes continued to sketch in the dark behind my eyelids. Routes, choke points. The slow, patient learning of a predator exploring a second environment. If I did nothing, the ship would reach port. The samples would disappear into another lab. The scratching would move from this hull to that one. The pattern would thread itself through the projects that had birthed it. If I tried to stop it alone with my current body, I'd likely die fast and accomplish little. Maybe that would slow it. Maybe not. I listened to my own breathing, not to calm myself, just to hear something I could still claim as mine. In the end, I made the same kind of choice I'd made on the drop manifest. I let inaction dress itself as pragmatism. I let the pattern continue. Somewhere deep in the ship, behind reinforced bulkheads and layers of quarantine, cradle restraints creaked as something inside tested their strength again. I watched the lines mapping that room in my mind and didn't reach for the comm. I'd told Command this thing could be an asset. I'd argued for its survival. Whatever came after belonged to me as much as to anyone who signed the orders. We hadn't destroyed what lay under Gharos Secundus. We'd brought it home.